I'm going to talk to you today about late harvest wine and late harvest wine pairings. And I know a thing or two about that because I'm German and I'm a winemaker. Welcome to our channel Uncorked. My name is Roland Zimmerman and I'm here today to talk to you about late harvest wine as well as late harvest wine pairings. So, a lot of the questions we get very frequently about late harvest is, why is it so sweet? Also, how is it made? And is there a legend attached to late harvest wines? I know this one quite well. And what are some of the best foods to pair with a late harvest wine? So, getting to the questions, why is late harvest wine sweet? Well, it's actually quite simple. It says it in the name. The grapes themselves were actually harvested at a later date to the regular harvest. This allows the grapes to ripen more on the vine, which, of course, as they ripen more, means that there's more sugar available in the wine or in the final product. Now, there are different ways to make late harvest, but that's the gist of it, and that's what's permitted in most parts of the world. Now, how is it made? This is a little more complicated. As I just mentioned, there are different ways to make it. So the most common way to make it is to actually, as I stated earlier, leave the grapes hanging on the vine until a much later date of the regular harvest. This allows a couple of things to happen in the vineyard. Number one, if the leaves are still on, there's more photosynthesis occurring, which means obviously there's a lot more sugar going into that juice, which is going to make the wine. There's also a certain mold that gets infected or that infects the grapes. This is botrytis. Now, don't worry, mold sounds bad, and in most cases it is. But this particular mold, what it does is it actually sucks out the juice out of the berry and dehydrates the berry, but leaves the sugar and an additional flavor compound from the mold in the actual juice. This is what gives late harvest its specific flavor in one aspect. So the other way that late harvests are frequently made is due to a second pressing of ice wine grapes. These are the two methods that we commonly use here in Ontario to make our late harvest wine, as that's what's also permitted. There are other ways to make it, but I won't get into those in such great detail here because that's not what we are permitted to do. So talking a little bit about the legend of late harvest wines and how they were made. I did address this in an earlier video in Sweet Red Wines, when you're more than welcome to rewatch it, but here's a quick summary. So back in the 1700s, grape growers, or peasants as they were, had to wait until they got the bishop's blessing in order to actually go into the vineyards and pick the grapes. And I mean this quite seriously. If you ever travel through Europe in the older vineyards, you will see on the vineyards themselves are actually fenced in and they have locks on them. And they're the old style locks, the skeleton key type of lock. And basically they had to wait until the bishop gave the holy assent to go and pick the grapes. Now, obviously, in order to get the message from the bishop, they had to kind of send a message to the bishop saying, hey, grapes are ready, can we go and pick? So this would usually be entrusted to a courier who would deliver the message. Keep in mind, the 1700s, they didn't have things like the postal service. They definitely didn't have internet or email or even text messages. So it was basically handwritten notes from either the mayor or the local guild or winery master saying, hey, look, we got to go pick. Can you give us your papal blessing in order to go get the grapes for this year's vintage? Now, the story is, that's the gist of how it works. The legend is the fact that one of the little villages entrusted this to a less reliable messenger than normally, and this individual managed to stop by every single pub on the way to the bishop. And of course, as he stopped at the pub, he got thirsty, and obviously he consumed a copious amount of alcohol, so that the next day it was a little harder to get up onto the horse and keep going to the next town. But needless to say, he did stop at every inn, as the legend states, and consumed various quantities of wine. And he didn't just do this on the way there, he did this on the way back. So normally this messenger would travel maybe 2 days, but in this particular instance, it took him 2 weeks. Now, of course, you're sitting there as a grower thinking like, my goodness, why is this taking so long? The sun is shining, weather's nice, there's no rain. Why is he still not back yet? And they really fretted about what they would be harvesting because they didn't get the papal blessing to go pick the grapes. Now, of course, the messenger did eventually come back, but it was 2 weeks after they had originally sent out the request. And the growers went out and picked what they saw in the vineyard, and they were aghast. They were shocked. It was moldy. It was, oh my gosh, we can't possibly make wine out of this. But we have to. The bishop is expecting wine. And that obviously stressed everybody out in the local village and really caused a lot of concern that the product that they were going to press out once they actually harvested it was probably going to be rotten, because they could see the mold forming on the actual vines. Desperate peasants that they were, they did actually pick the grapes and they actually pressed them out. And what came out was this golden nectar like they had never ever experienced before. It was in fact not runny like water or like apple juice or grape juice that you might be familiar with. It almost had more of a consistency of honey. Now, it wasn't quite that concentrated, but it was definitely more viscous, a lot slower running. And forgive the image, but motor oil kind of compared to water in terms of its viscosity. And that's essentially what they said, okay, well, you know what, this is what the good Lord wants us to do this year. So they fermented it out and were really surprised and shocked by the quality as well as the flavors they got out of this product. They'd never experienced anything like this before, never happened before. And essentially they said, well, okay, what are we going to call this? This is a unique product. We don't usually have grapes harvested this late. So they came up with the name, which is very German, of late harvest. It's a very logical conclusion that you harvested this wine later than you should have. Therefore, we're going to call it a late harvest wine. Now, some of the characteristics of late harvest wine is that they're actually sweet. This is a very important characteristic because that was the defining thing historically. It's like this is a sweet wine, even though it has about 12 or even 13% alcohol. And that was very, very hard to achieve back in the time of this particular legend. So that is one of the characteristics. The other one is that it has a far more intense flavor than regular wines. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this comes about because of that particular mold, the botrytis mold that occurs naturally in the vineyard when the grapes are left hanging for an extended period of time. Obviously, in today's modern agriculture, there are specific treatments that you can apply to prevent this mold from occurring naturally in the vineyard. This is very important for red wines because if red wines get this mold on the skin, it destroys the color compounds. Again, this is alluded to in an earlier video that we have explained about how to produce these specific high quality red wines. Digressing back, that mold is very important for the late harvest flavor because it imparts, because of the extraction of the water, it crystallizes, or more specifically, concentrates a lot of those flavor compounds you might have normally sort of picked up just very gently in the wine as you were drinking it. Think of, okay, it's got that little touch of lime or a little bit of lemon flavor. This would be, wow, okay, I can really taste the lemon. The lime is very pronounced kind of flavor is what usually is provided in a late harvest wine. Late harvest wine can be made from a number of different varieties. Commonly here in Ontario, it's made from Riesling, it's made from Vidal. It can also be made from Sauvignon Blanc. It's basically any white variety essentially can be made into a late harvest wine. Obviously, there are certain varietals that are more suited because of the existing flavor characteristics that they have, as well as the other physiological aspects of it. For example, having a little bit higher acidity or having in the natural growing season already a higher or elevated amount of sugar. Hence why those varieties that I've listed are commonly used here. Some of the other questions, one of the last questions we always get is, what do I pair this wine with? So this is a very versatile wine. And what I mean by that is, because of its sweetness, you can actually bring it over into categories of desserts if you choose to do so. This again depends on the sweetness, because late harvests do have a range of sweetness. They can be just a touch on the sweet side, so a little sweeter than your sweet wines that you would expect, or they can be really, really sweet. In Ontario, we call those types of wines select late harvest wines, or the other one that's commonly known is TBA wines. This is a German term which stands for Trocken Beeren Auslese. Yeah, don't worry about it. You don't even have to try to pronounce it. Just remember TBA, and most people in the industry will completely understand what you're talking about, unless you happen to be in Germany or in Austria, in which case brush up on your language skills. Getting back to the pairings, the numerous different options are available because of the sweetness, as I mentioned earlier, but also because of the intense flavor that this wine has. So one of my favorite pairings with late harvest is actually chocolate truffles. That sounds a little counterintuitive, because chocolate truffles can usually be very intense in flavor, but the late harvest balances out the flavor of the intensity of the chocolate. Again, it does depend on your chocolate truffle, but my personal favorite is obviously a pistachio truffle with, or pistachio chocolate truffle with a late harvest Vidal, of which I did bring an example here. This is one of our lovely examples. See the snowflake, indicative of later in the season? Anyways, that's just a shameless plug on our behalf. Thank you very much for watching today. Drop us a like, and we look forward to any comments you have, and keep them coming. Thank you.